Okay.
You can sell my likeness to the government later on. Awesome. Well, super happy to be here, everyone. Really excited to chat with you. So I want to start with a quick story. So a few years ago, back in 2013, I was at Georgetown University. I was studying business. I was in my senior year of college. And back then, as Justin had mentioned, I was actually working on my very first company, which was called Encore Alert. I was going around Washington, D.C., attending different pitch competitions. And this is me at a little mixer talking about our company, the little banner that I printed on Vistaprint. And meanwhile, all of my other classmates were out there getting jobs. My roommate guy was an accountant. He had just finished up an internship at PwC in New York and got a full-time offer. The valedictorian of my class, Russell, also had locked down a consulting job in New York at Bain. My friend Michelle had ended up at Airbnb at a tech job. And then my co-founder of my company at the time, Mike Hauser, even him, he had a job lined up as well. He was going to go work in a bank at Citibank in Chicago. And so here I was basically sitting in my dorm at Georgetown, trying to figure out what the heck I was doing with my life. All of these, my friends had basically these six-figure jobs lined up already. And they were basically already enjoying their senior life, enjoying their senioritis. And I was sitting on my dorm bed without a job and trying to figure out what to do next with my life. We didn't have any funding for our company. We didn't have enough customers to be profitable yet. And so I was kind of staring it in the face. And as a lot of you can imagine, being college students, there's a lot of FOMO, right? Figuring out where I wanted to go next, but then looking at everyone else around me and realizing that I wasn't at the same place that everyone else was. People were already had their job offers locked down and they were already coasting. And meanwhile, I was working day in and day out on my company and trying to figure out what to do next after graduating and making sure that my parents wouldn't completely disown me after I graduated. And so I actually started applying for consulting jobs. A lot of consulting companies came on campus. They started giving, those sort of information sessions, and I started attending them. And, in my gut, I just didn't feel great. I knew that this is not the thing that I wanted to do. I started going up to the speakers afterwards, getting in line. I was like the 25th person in line, trying to shake the hand of the person giving the info session, sending follow-up emails, applying for interviews, kind of half-heartedly reading the case review or the case interview, like prep work that a lot of my friends were doing, and not really getting into it. And I walk into these offices that were just beautiful glass offices. I remember one of the top, 4 consulting firms I interviewed for literally had like a waterfall that was going indoors from like the 4th floor to the 2nd floor. And I walked in my suit and I was looking at the waterfall. I'm like, oh my gosh, man, this is crazy, right? Compare that to that dingy room that I was giving my my pitch in earlier in the photo that you saw. And as I was applying for each of these jobs, one of the things the interviewers kept asking me, looking at my resume, was like, why are you applying for this? What do you want to get out of this? It looks like you are starting your own companies, you're working on your own stuff. Like, this doesn't even really seem like a good fit for you. And even though I knew that was true deep down in my heart, I kept applying and I kept giving them answers. Well, I just want to join a consulting firm so I can learn for a couple of years and then maybe, figure out if there's problems that, are worth solving with entrepreneurship, et cetera, and things like that. And needless to say, the interviews didn't go well. So I was on my way home one day from one of these interviews, literally wearing a blue suit like the one you see on the screen here. And I run into one of my startup mentors at the time, this guy named Alan. Alan had been a super successful entrepreneurship at a really young age. He was only 1 year older than I was, but at the time he had already sold a company to Chegg, which, as you know, the textbook company. And at the time he was already starting a startup accelerators. He was investing in startups. He had started another company. And here's me dressed in my blue suit, kind of walking down the streets of Washington, D.C., coming home from one of my interviews. And he comes the other way on the street wearing, kind of the startup attire, right? So a t-shirt and jeans and everything. And he goes, James, what are you doing? And I was like, suddenly my cheeks feel blush and I got really ashamed. Right? I was like, I just came from an interview. He's like, with who? And I told him, a consulting firm. And he was like, wait, what? And he gives me this sucker punch right in my shoulder. like just punches me straight on the street. Like I almost think like if you're a stranger watching this, you would have thought like I was getting assaulted or something like that on the street. And he goes, "What the hell are you doing, man?" He's like, "Why aren't you following your dream?" And that moment, both physically and also mentally, just jolted me out of this like slumber, basically, where I was like, "Oh my gosh, what am I doing?" Right. And at the time, I had gone so deep into this tunnel of interviewing for these jobs that I didn't even want, because all of my friends were getting these jobs, that I kind of stopped working on my own company, stopped making progress, and really kind of put that on the back burner. But that was such a good reminder, and I thank Alan to this day for kind of lifting me out of that spell, basically, out of that FOMO, and helped me get realigned to what was really, really important to me. Ultimately, it kind of actually ended up being a good ending to the story. As I was graduating, Alan actually ended up becoming the very first investor in our company. Him and his fund ended up being willing to put the first 30K into my very first company, which allowed me to at least not have a job for 6 months and try to figure things out. But I tell this story because one of the things I want to talk about today, and I talked to Justin about, that I want to present about, is founder habits. I know that not everyone on this call today will end up starting their companies. Some of you will. Some of you might want to, maybe later in your life, in your 30s and 40s, after you've had a chance to try out different industries. But I found that there's, at least 3 really strong founder habits that I wanted to share with you all today that you can apply to every part of your life. And so what I'll do today is I'll talk about these 3 habits. I'll kind of intersperse my story a little bit in between this, so you can kind of know a little bit more about my experiences with entrepreneurship and how I got to where I am today. And then the last but not least, one of the things that Justin wanted to make sure that I covered, and I will do so kind of throughout, but in questions as well, is what is it like being an engineer, especially in Silicon Valley, and also working in kind of the tech space, whether it's hardware engineering, software engineering, what are kind of some of the myths that are out there? What does it take to get a career, set up a career that is in this space? And hopefully answer some questions at the end as well. Awesome. So let's dive right in. So the first habit that I wanted to cover is evaluate what matters, right? So I just told you the story about me feeling this FOMO in college. And I think college is obviously this amazing place. You have a lot of friends. You're all kind of, usually living together. I know that's not the case now, but a lot of times we have this kind of tribal or herd mentality that, oh, my friends are doing this, my friends are doing that, all kind of do the same thing that they do as well. And I am a very, very strong believer in this quote here from Casey Neistat. He's one of my favorite YouTubers. Some of you may know him from his vlogs that he posts on YouTube about his life in New York and now in Los Angeles. But he basically talks about how in life you should be doing 2 things ever: discovering your passion and then realizing it. Now, I know that seems super, super fluffy. Everyone's like, find your passion, talk about your passion, like figure out what that is. So I kind of want to break that down a little bit today and talk about that with a little bit of a workshop, basically. So I would love for everyone to either just get out a quick piece of paper. It could be a scratch piece of paper. It doesn't have to be a brand new sheet of paper. Yep, that includes you, Justin. We'll do this together. Or you can just open up a note on your computer. It can just be a Google Doc or a Word doc. And we're going to do a super, super quick exercise together. Hopefully this is not going to be too cringe. We're just going to do this together. I'm going to do this here as well. But if I could leave you with anything today, regardless of my story about entrepreneurship, regardless of anything else, it's this. I want you to really take at least a couple minutes, whether it's during this call or whether it's afterwards or the weekend when you have some quiet time alone, to think about what really, really matters to you specifically. I think too many people go through life, and especially college, going through the motions. You've got your class schedule, you've got to hit certain grades, you have maybe a GPA that you want to hit, maybe not. You have certain clubs and organizations, friends and parties, relationships, etc. And there's so many things that are going on in our life, but we so rarely pause to think about what truly, truly matters to you. And we often spend a lot of our time just kind of doing what everyone else does. And so what I want to do is I want to spend 1 minute, and what we're going to do is do this exercise. I want you to write down, if you can, split your sheet into 2. So for example, here, if I had my piece of paper, I just ripped my paper in half. if I have my sheet of paper, I want you to fold it hot dog style, basically. And then on one side of the column, I want you to start writing a small list, maybe 5 to 10 items of what's really important to you. And then you can kind of, you're lacking ideas, you can choose some of the ones that are here on the screen. So here I have some of them listed, right? Mentorship, curiosity, maybe your faith, maybe being a leader and having responsibility. Maybe it's family, right? Whether it's a family like your parents and loved ones, or maybe it's your own family that you hope to start one day. Maybe it's financial independence, right? You just want to make sure that you have as much financial freedom as possible. Maybe it's getting as good grades as possible so that you can get to the career that you want. So just take a quick second here, write down a few things. I'm going to do it too. It's a great exercise. And think about, what do you think is really, really important to you, and what gives you energy? What makes you feel really purposeful when you're able to achieve some of these things? I'll just give everyone just a couple more seconds. We'll keep this moving pretty quickly. All right. So now that you've done that, I want you to mark how important each one is. So you can do this a couple of different ways. You can maybe put a 1, 2, and 3 next to the most important 3 ones on your list, or you can just circle the most important ones. So if you've got your list on the left side of your sheet, like I have here, go ahead and circle the ones that you feel like, if I were to really force you to make a decision, what are the 2 or 3 things that are must-haves in your life, no matter what? Okay. So let's hold on to that piece of paper because I'm going to revisit it here in part 2. But hopefully, this is an important exercise that you can do for yourself every year, right? A lot of people talk about doing New Year's resolutions or setting, my goals for 2020. But actually what I found that's more important to me is not to figure out what specific goals I want to achieve, but more importantly, what my North Star is. Because a lot of times life will take a really windy path and you create all these plans, but then the plans go, basically to shit, right? We talk about 2020 and the way that this year has gone. I'm sure it's not the way that any of you have expected it to go. And yet, even in a year like 2020, having these North Stars to kind of ground you is more important than ever, right? And that can really help you make your decisions on where you spend your time. So keep that in mind. Let's come back to this piece of paper in a second, but let me continue with my story. So at Encore, we ended up actually continuing to build the company. As I mentioned, Alan was actually our first ever investor, so we had the first 30K in mind. Then it was the tricky part was finding a co-founder. At the time, I was our business person. We had a designer, but we didn't have an engineer. And at the time, Georgetown was not known as much of an engineering school, so it was really hard to go to the computer science department and just kind of walk in and try to find someone there. Most people were not really coding, in college at the time. And so what I actually ended up doing was I went on angellist.com, which is one of the best communities for entrepreneurs and investors, et cetera. And we posted a job description for a technical co-founder. And I actually met my co-founder Felipe through AngelList. So a lot of people joke, like, how did you meet your co-founder? Like I always say, we met on like a co-founder dating site. Like we really met online. And what's crazy was that Felipe was in Brazil at the time. He had never been to the United States before. He was working on a large company. He was working at Dell. And I was just a senior sitting in my PJs in my underground basement dorm and basically Skyping with him and trying to pretend that I was, much more put together than I actually was. And what ended up happening was with that 30K, we paid for a plane ticket for Felipe to fly into Washington, D.C. he came straight from the airport to my graduation ceremony, sat next to my parents. My parents were like, who the heck is this Brazilian guy like that you invited to your ceremony? And then for the 6 months after that, we actually moved in together and roomed together to save on rent so that we could start the company together. And this is a place that was full of cockroaches. It kept getting flooded because it was a rainy summer in Washington, D.C. But it was it really brought us together. I mean, it was a little risky because we hadn't met each other in person before, but we knew that we worked together well. And now, kind of fast forward to 8 years later, we're actually co-founding our second company together. I had flown to Brazil to be a groomsman at his wedding, and he's now expecting his first kid. So it's crazy. And, I always joke that I'm basically his second marriage, right? As opposed to his wife. But we started working on Encore Alert, and we were building the company. This is my first time as a founder. We're trying to figure everything out. And one thing that started happening that I didn't realize was happening was my health actually started getting really, really bad. And one of the things I actually wrote here on the left section of my paper is physical health. And the reason is that as I was working on Encore Alert, I kept telling myself that I wasn't stressed. I had this kind of facade that I was putting up for my team. No stress level 0, everything's okay. We're all good. But at the same time, I wasn't taking care of myself. I wasn't working out. I wasn't exercising. I was eating really poorly. I remember basically eating way too much Panera on the way home from work every single day because that was the easiest thing to do. And 4 years later, I realized that I was actually going to the restroom 5 times a day, 10 times a day, sometimes even, to the point where my co-founders were like, are you in the bathroom again? And I was playing it off. I was like, yeah, it's fine. We just ate some ramen. It was probably really oily. I think it's fine. And then I went to the doctor because my dad was like, yo, this is not, normal, James. I was like, yeah, you're right. I went to the doctor and the doctor was like, hey, I think you have irritable bowel syndrome. And irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, is often caused by stress. And so what I realized was that the 3 or 4 years that I had worked on Encore Alert and kind of thought that I was not stressed, everything was going straight to my stomach and I wasn't taking care of myself. And one of the things that kind of really reminded me about was how a lot of us talk about, oh, I don't have time to exercise. Oh, I don't have time for this. I don't have time for that. I mean, how many things on this list do we not have time for? And one of the things that I'm always reminded of is even the president of the United States takes time to exercise every single day. And I'm pretty sure that none of us are as busy as the president of the United States. I mean, maybe someone on this call is. I'd love to meet you after. But if it's all about priorities. And so that's lesson number 2 that I want to talk about is actions express priorities. One of the biggest things, as you guys all know in college, is everyone likes to talk about how tired they are and how busy they are. I think that's total bullshit. I think that's one of those weird badges that we all walk around with our bags under our eyes in the library at 4 a.m. And we're everyone's like, yo, how are you doing, man? And you're like, oh, I'm so tired. I'm just so tired. But one of my favorite books here, Rework, which I would encourage you if you're interested in business at all, I would love for you to check out. It's one of my favorite books of all time. They talk about being tired isn't a badge of honor. Sustained exhaustion is not a rite of passage. It's a mark of stupidity, right? Because we all have the same amount of time, but how we spend that time expresses our priorities. So what do you spend your time on, right? It's time to kind of look inward again. So let's look at the other side of the piece of paper. And I want you to maybe open up your calendar or whatever you have that you have your time. If you don't have a calendar, it's fine as well. Just think about the last 24 hours. And just quickly jot down, again, 5 to 10 things that you've done in the last week or the last 24 hours that you've spent a lot of time on. So here I have a couple of examples on the left. Of course, there's a lot of things that we can't be doing during COVID, like parties, but homework, classes, time with friends, time with family, playing sports, exercising. Let's just take 1 minute here on the right side of your piece of paper, on the other side, and write down what you've actually been spending your time on. Okay, so the obvious juxtaposition here is comparing the left side of your paper to the right side of the paper, right? Figuring out, are the things that you circled on the left side of the paper really being reflected in your life? Even as I'm telling you that story about my IBS and the lack of exercise and eating healthy and things like that, I'm writing things down on my right side of my paper and realizing that this past week I've been working super hard, having a lot of FaceTimes with my girlfriend, and then and also just throwing in a little bit of time on my PS4 playing a brand new game that I got for F1, and realizing that I'm not spending as much time on my exercise and my physical health, calling my parents where I would want to spend more time, and also on mentorship. One of my big things that I would love to do more of is mentoring other entrepreneurs. I want to start a podcast with a friend of mine, and we haven't been dedicating as much time to it recently as we'd like. And so, this kind of inventory, this only you're looking at it, right? You notice I haven't asked anyone to type anything in the Zoom group chat, to share anything. This is extremely personal. This is not a judgment. I'm not trying to shame anyone. In fact, I myself and have a lot of things that I want to work on, but this is just a great exercise to kind of spend a little bit of time on once a year and just make sure that things are aligned with your North Star before you kind of get whisked away to doing all the same things that everyone else is spending time on. This is actually a good place for me to kind of pause and talk about something real quick. I actually want to talk a little bit about what I mentioned earlier about kind of tips and tricks about being an engineer in the tech world and being a engineer in perhaps Silicon Valley, but also of course in SoCal and LA as well. I'll revisit more of this at the end, but this is a great kind of place for me to insert one specific tip that I have for everyone, which is when in doubt, create. At this point, my CTO, Felipe, and I have hired dozens of engineers, and we've looked through tons and tons of resumes. Obviously, we have lots and lots of friends who are hiring engineers as well for different roles. And while, of course, it is absolutely an engineering friendly market, and what I mean by that is, the demand for engineers inside the tech world is still very, very high. It's still a matter of how much leverage you have over that process, right? So what I mean by that is, even though there are many, many opportunities out there, if you want to position yourself for the opportunities that you want, then ideally you want to make yourself as strong of a candidate as possible. So supply and demand dynamics are still absolutely the same in the tech world when it comes to engineers, but now I'm kind of talking about level 2 strats, right? I'm talking about how to get to that next level of you being able to pick where you want to work. And one of the things that I feel like students especially miss the most, and I miss this all the time when I was a student, is that you'll be evaluated much more on what you've created than just your grades. I remember Chris Sacca, one of the most famous investors in Silicon Valley. He's often on Shark Tank. He's the partner at Lowercase Capital, and he's known for being one of the first investors in Twitter. He was a Georgetown grad as well. He came back and gave a speech once. And one of the things that I remember to this day is that he said, I've literally been asked for my shoe size more often than I've been asked for my GPA. And that's not to say that grades aren't important. I would never say that with Justin on the line. But what I mean by that is that I think people a lot of times a little bit miss the forest for the trees, right? It's great to have great grades. I think you should, and especially me having Asian parents. Look, I get it. I had to get straight A's all throughout college. Otherwise, my parents would kill me, right? But what's really important in the real world when it comes to working is actually projects that you've shipped. And I know there are lots of different kinds of engineers that are on this call today. So what that means for each of you is very, very different. But what I mean by that is if there's a side project that you've been kind of noodling on or thinking about for a while, or perhaps there's a specific project that you've done in class that you might want to take a little bit extra further, really work on that. Because when people sit down and we talk about, when we do interviews, we don't really care that much what school did you go to, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I know that there are still, of course, a lot of HR managers that screen for that thing first. But what's really, really important and sets you apart from that period is what you've shipped and what you've created and who you've created it with, right? Some projects maybe you create on your own, and some maybe you work on a team and you could talk about, hey, I worked with two of my friends. I handled this. I handled the front end or the back end. He or she handled this. And essentially talk about those stories and show and not tell, right? That's what's really, really important in the real world, especially in the Valley, especially in tech jobs. So I always give this advice because one of the biggest things is that when you come straight out of school, a lot of your resumes will look basically the same, right? You'll say, I have an engineering degree from this institution. And so how do you really set yourself apart? And I'm telling you now, that's not really going to be the GPA. It's going to be what hard skills you already have and how you've mastered them by actually shipping those products out. I'll give a great example of this later on, or I'll come back to this, but there's a friend of mine in San Diego who one of his side projects is he created breakoutlist.com. And breakoutlist.com is simply a website that literally ranks all of the top tech companies as well as the open jobs at each of those companies. But the rank isn't by the success of the company or by the size of the company. The rank is actually by how fast that company is growing. Because ideally you want to join, if you're going to join an early company, you want to join a company that's on, you want to get a seat on a rocket ship, basically, is the analogy. And so what he did as a side project is he created this website called breakoutlist.com. He has his own algorithm in the back that takes all this independent private data and sorts it, and it creates this list of companies that are willing to be a part of this list. This is not his full-time job. He makes no money off of it. There's no monetization on this whatsoever. It's not like he's getting affiliate fees. But just even having a site like this that's pretty well known across the valley is incredible if you ever wanted to get hired by any of these companies, because all these companies are, oh yeah, you're the breakout list guy, right? Like, you know about specific projects that they've shipped, not about, hey, how sophisticated are you around Python and JavaScript? Those are, of course, very, very important, but the best way to do it is to show, not tell. I can come back to this in a second. This would probably be a good time to mention too, if you have any questions about this type of stuff, about working in the tech world, about anything I'm talking about whatsoever, feel free to drop it in the chat box, and I'll keep answering as I go. Cool. So kind of on to part 3, the last part of my story, then we can open up for questions. So fast forward to the second round of funding that we're raising. So at the time, we had already raised about $600,000 for Encore Alert. This is my first company, my last company. And we were growing a little bit. We weren't growing a ton. I was still figuring it out how to, actually do sales and how to make sure that we were selling to companies and closing deals and things like that. And we started running out of money, and we needed to raise another round of funding from investors. And at the time, I remember I had called a lot of East Coast investors and things like that. And we got introduced to an accelerator out here on the West Coast in San Francisco called 500 Startups. And if you're not familiar, an accelerator basically is a 4-month program where they'll take anywhere between 10 to 100 companies, depending on the accelerator. They'll invest a little bit about amount of money, so like 100K, for example, just to make sure that you have some living expenses covered for your whole team. But you essentially hunker down in this office at this accelerator, and it's exactly what the word means, accelerator. They accelerate your progress. They give you a lot of mentorship. They give you advice. They bring in guest speakers. They bring in workshops, anything that's to possibly make you successful. And at the end of the 4 months, they throw this huge event called Demo Day. So they put you in front of 2,000 investors. You go on this crazy intimidating stage, and you've got the lights shining down your face. You can barely see anyone. You're sweating like crazy. And you're up there and you give a 3-minute pitch about what your company does. And hopefully someone will throw money at you, right? And so we got this introduction to 500 Startups. At the time, we were like, man, do we really want to move out to San Francisco? We had a team in DC. Many of them were unwilling to move. But we said, hey, this is a pretty prestigious accelerator. How many chances at this are we really going to get in our lives? So why don't we just pick up and move for 4 months, and we'll figure it out later. We pack up everything. I remember literally had signed a lease on a brand new apartment at the time, and I had to break that lease because I was like, all right, I'm going to San Francisco instead. Got to SFO, rented a car, and all lived in a house together. So this is my second time living with Felipe again. At this point, he's almost married. So his wife's like, what the heck is going on? Why do you keep sleeping with this dude? And I remember walking in the first day to 500 Startups. And the first thing that happens is that we're assigned a mentor. And this guy walks in and he looks like this, right? This Asian dude with dreads. And I'm like, what the heck is happening, right? And he's like, hi, I'm Nemo. I'm like, Nemo? Like the fish, like the movie, right? And so Nemo and I sit down in a room together, and he goes, I want you to walk us through all of your KPIs, your key performance indicators right now. I want you to tell me how much money you've made, how many leads you're generating each week for your sales team, what the percentage to close is, what the percentage open rate on your emails is, what the percentage response rate is. And he just gets on a whiteboard, he starts writing things down. And I thought I was sweaty, during that pitch, but I was really sweaty, right? Now you see a theme, really sweaty during this meeting, right? So I'm sitting there and I'm fumbling over my words. I'm like, I don't know, because no one on the East Coast had ever asked us this question before, where it was so regimented and so clear. So of course I try to come up with whatever numbers I have on the top of my head. And he goes, okay, where are you going to be next week? This time next week, Thursday at 2 p.m., where are you going to be with these numbers? And I was like, what? Okay. I'm going to increase my number of emails by 20%. Okay. 20%. Why not 50%? I was like, okay, 50%. So I write 50% down and 50% increase. I'm like, my whole team's like looking at me like, how the heck are we going to get 50% increase in 1 week? Like, I'm literally have to pull like extra hours. I'm kicking them underneath the table. Like, don't worry about it. We'll figure it out. Right. And then he's like, all right, this is how you're going to get it done. I have these tips for you. Like, go get it done. And in my mind, the meeting was literally like a year. Like, it lasted like a year. Like, it lasted at least 2 hours. And I come out and I look at the clock and 25 minutes had passed. That's it. And I was like, my mind was blown, right? I had never experienced that caliber of mentorship in my life. And I'd been working in startups for like 2.5 years already. And so my third and last tip, which again is a founder habit that is applicable to everyone on this call, is find great mentors. Many of you might have heard this statement: you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with, from Jim Rohn. I am a huge, huge believer in this statement, right? If you think about the sheet of paper we just created, the left side and the right side, and you think about the right side of where you're spending the most time, who are you spending that time with, right? Is it a significant other? Is it your family? Is it a certain set of friends? Is it a certain clique or a group? And you become the average of that, right? I remember like when I was a kid and I used to travel to Shanghai to just see my grandparents once a year, I would spend like a month there and I would come back basically speaking like Shanghainese, right? Like, that's how quickly I was picking a lot of stuff up, because I was spending time around all these people. So again, leaving you with an action item from today, besides just this piece of paper, is there someone who has done what you want to do, like what you want to accomplish, that you can learn from? When I was in college and starting this company, kind of besides Nemo, I remember that I wanted to reach out to Ted Leonsis. Now, if you don't know Ted Leonsis, he founded AOL. Yes, those like old discs. Now, nobody on this call remembers. Who am I kidding? And after selling AOL for $1 billion, he now owns the Washington Wizards and the Washington Capitals and the Washington Mystics. So he owns all the sports teams, all the basketball and hockey teams in Washington, D.C. Everyone except the Nationals and the soccer team, basically. So he's one of the richest alumni that Georgetown has ever had. And I remember for one of our projects in business school, we had to interview like a well-known entrepreneur. And so people were reaching out, some people kind of half-assed this project. They kind of reached out to their friends who were entrepreneurs. A lot of people like reached out to me, and I was like, haha, very funny. Like, I can't be your interview. I'm in the same class as you are. But I remember someone was like, hey, like, why don't we reach out to Ted Leonsis? And literally Ted's email was like tedleonsis@AOL.com, right? This is like 6 years after AOL was cool. So like, you can, kudos to this guy for sticking to his guns, right? I was thinking to myself, like, this guy is literally a billionaire and runs like 3 sports teams along with a bunch of, his VC firm, et cetera. Like, there's no way he's going to respond. So I email him, kind of write an email template. I'm like, Ted, I would love to meet with you. I'm a Georgetown student. I'm doing this project for a class, but I actually really want to meet with you just to ask you some questions about Georgetown entrepreneurship in general, how you got there, et cetera, et cetera. And he answered in 20 minutes. He literally, probably on his phone, but basically he answered in 20 minutes. It was just a one-liner, but it was basically like he CC'd his assistant. He's like, let's find a time. And I was like, mind blown, right? Like, I was like, I can't believe that this guy would actually respond. So I actually created a process for all of you, because I know that some of you maybe are more unfamiliar with this process of finding a mentor. Who do I find? How do I reach out to them? So I'm actually going to walk you through this process that I have. And one of the things that you can do afterwards too is list the types of people, as I'm talking, that you would like to have as mentors underneath your, when you have your 2 sections underneath that, who can really help you achieve what you want to achieve. Is there anyone in your life that you already know that fits these profiles of who you want? And one of the best ways to meet mentors is through a warm introduction. So we're going to talk about exactly how to do that step by step, super, super tactical, like get really into the weeds. I'm going to show you the email templates to do that, right? But this is one of the number one founder hacks inside Silicon Valley. Whenever people ask you, oh, how do you raise tons of money? How do you raise millions? Like we've just raised $3 million for my current company, Mighty Health. It's all through this process. It's all through introductions. And I use this process over and over again in college and now as well. And so we're going to talk exactly about this. So there's a concept inside this, the Valley or in the tech world of the double opt-in intro. So what you do is you basically use LinkedIn. Now, of course, everyone's like LinkedIn. Like I haven't used LinkedIn in like months. And like LinkedIn seems like such a useless tool when you're a student. And then afterwards, you're like, holy crap, this is an incredible tool. And now I've been paying premium for LinkedIn for years now. But if there's a specific person that you want to reach, obviously you go on LinkedIn and you try to find if there's a second degree connection to that person, right? So ideally you have someone that you know who knows that person. Again, if you don't, that's completely fine as well. You can use a similar template to reach out, just like I did with Ted Leonsis, and just reach out. You know, again, the worst thing that can happen is that they either say no or they ignore your email. That's it, right? No feelings hurt. Don't take it personally. That's basically it. So why not put more feelers out there? There's really no downside. The double opt-in intro that you can see here is basically, if you find that second degree connection, you basically want to send that person an email that they can easily forward to the other person. We call it a blurb, but basically it's something that the person who's making the introduction, your mutual contact, doesn't have to put in any real additional effort to rewrite your email, right? So you write the email like this: hey, John, I'm going to be out in the Bay Area all next week. We're looking to raise our institutional seed round. If you know any investors who may be interested or anybody you think I should meet when I'm out there, please let me know. And then below, we include everything they need about what Encore Alert does, right? This is what the company does. This is who the team is. This is why we're different from other competitors. Here are some of our customers and here are some of our metrics. We've been growing revenue 40% month over month for the last 6-7 months, right? The double opt-in is extremely important because it's basically asking them to ask the other person for permission to make the introduction. So say that I was asking Justin to make an introduction to one of his mentors. I cannot assume that his mentor is willing to take that intro. Like that's just way too much assumption. If anything, it leaves a bad taste in people's mouth. So what I want to do is I want to send Justin an email that looks like this, that Justin can forward along to his mentor and make sure that they are giving him permission to make the intro. So say everything goes well. I forward to Justin. Justin forwards to the person's like responds really quickly. Yeah, of course, I'll take the intro. Thanks for thinking of me, right? So the next template that goes out, it looks a little bit like this. This is how you write that next template. You go, Justin makes the intro to say Ben. And then I jump in and try to answer that email as soon as I can. You want to be the first person to jump in there. You don't want to wait for Ben to respond. You want to be as proactive as possible. So you say, hey, Ben, it's great to meet you. As Justin mentioned, I'm transitioning to this. I'd love to learn some best practices. Talk about why you want to meet them. And then give them some specific times. You don't want them to go to their calendar and open a whole calendar and be like, this is, you know what, I'll just get back to this person later. You know, pitch them 2 or 3 specific times to meet for coffee or where you want to meet them, right? It might be a Zoom coffee at this point. Or please let me know if there's another time that would work better and I'll shoot over an invite. Thanks in advance for your advice. So this is basically the process for getting that, is being super proactive, jumping in, and if they don't respond, continue to follow up. I read a stat somewhere that 90% of a salesperson's job is just following up, right? And a lot of people just don't do that. And then what you do next is you prepare for the meeting, right? So if it's a 30-minute meeting, if it's a 1-hour meeting, even if it's a 15-minute meeting, come in with questions prepared. Do your research ahead of time. Read the last 3 pieces of news about this person. If any of you listen to podcasts and you listen to the Tim Ferriss podcast, you'll know like Tim Ferriss is such a great interviewer because he does so much homework ahead of time on his guests. Sometimes he'll ask questions like, hey, I know that in high school you used to be a waiter at this restaurant. And then the guest will be like, okay, but I'm the CEO of Disney now. How would you even know that, right? And he's like, well, you know, me and my team like looked into that, right? Like something that gets to the questions that you really want to know and that you're not wasting their time. And again, this is where whatever questions you have in your life, like talk to the mentor and ask them. If there's a specific job that you want, say your dream is to become a lead engineer in a Formula One team, right? That's one of the things that's been on my mind recently is a lot of people are asking that. The best way to learn about how to do that is to ask people who are doing that right now and say, what was your path to getting there, right? Like, what kinds of projects did you work on in college? What was your thesis about? Like, how did you get to where you are today? So prepare those questions ahead of time, bring a notebook, take notes, be super attentive, and be an active listener, right? Like, nod your head and really like think about their answers and really try to summarize the answers back to them and be a good listener. And then afterwards, follow up. Write an old-fashioned thank you note, even if it's 2 sentences. Write an email, follow up to them and say, hey, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. I really enjoyed when you talked about these 1 or 2 specific things. I'm going to take that to heart and I'm going to work on those. And a lot of people will say, okay, well, what if it's a mentor I really like and how do I keep in touch with them? Like, isn't it like, I feel like I'm taking a lot of the mentor's time. Like, I feel like I'm always just taking and not giving. And I feel bad about that. And that's a misconception a lot of people have. Because if someone's willing to mentor you, it's likely because they are also finding value in both teaching you as well as sharing some of their information and seeing you thrive. And so one of the best things, this is literally like the gold standard of what you can do for a mentor, is essentially writing them a follow-up a couple months later and say, hey, I actually took your advice and I did this and here's what happened, even if it didn't work out. Because what happens is a lot of my times, like most of the time when I give advice, you'll tell someone something and it'll disappear forever, which is totally fine. I mean, I still get a lot about that out of that conversation. I still really enjoy myself and I get a lot of energy out of it. But what's even better is those 2 or 3 students who will come back and say, hey, I actually attended this hackathon and we actually won because we did this 1 or 2 concepts that we discussed last week. And I just wanted to thank you for that. Nothing else. Didn't want anything more out of it, etc. And it makes me feel amazing, right? And that's how you build that long-term relationship with some of these mentors. Maybe you have 10, 20 mentorship conversations. The way that I personally would structure it is to have at least 1 mentor conversation at least every couple of weeks. Maybe be the same mentor, maybe a different mentor every time. And finally, you find one that you really like and you keep in touch with them and you send them an email update once a quarter or something like that. This is what I've been up to. When it's time for you to look for your careers, that warm introduction can be the most powerful thing by anything. When we talk about these everyone talks about these job processes. You're creating your resume, your cover letter, how you submit to a specific application portal. Guess what? All those things don't even matter if you actually know the person, right? Again, it's who you know. And so you could go through that process, but that level 3 strat is actually knowing who, is connected to those people at those companies and actually imagine having that conversation with that person when you're a sophomore and saying, hey, I really want to work here. Tell me everything there is about working there. How do I get there? And then 2 years later, you're like, hey, I've graduated and I've shipped these projects. I would love this type of role. I'll put in an application through the official portal, but I just want to give you a heads up that I'm applying. Guess what? And guess whose application is going to get flagged to the top of the pile? It's going to be yours, right? And so that's the level 3 strat. The level 2 strat, as I mentioned earlier, is just making sure that you're shipping product and not just, focusing only on, kind of the same validation that everyone else is focused on. All right, so kind of wrapping everything up here and kicking into questions and anything like that is I want everyone to remember these 3 kind of founder mindsets, right? Evaluate what matters. That's the left side of the sheet. Actions expresses priorities. That's the right side of the sheet. And then find great mentors. That's the bottom of your sheet. Really, no matter whether you want to start a company or not, or if you're going to work at a big firm or a small startup when you graduate, whatever it is, of course, I wish you the best of luck. But these types of mindsets will carry you far. Again, these are the level 2, level 3 strats. They're incredibly important no matter what you do. If you're interested in tech, this is the website that I was talking about earlier, breakoutlist.com. It's constantly being updated, especially in a tough job market. It has a cross-reference to some of the companies that are actually hiring. And these are the companies that are beyond what we call the FANG, right? FANG is Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, etc. Of course, we know that those jobs are amazing, but if you want to look a little bit further, say, for example, you want to go to a smaller startup or a smaller company and you just want to have a bigger role there, right? You don't want to be like a smaller cog in the wheel. You want to be someone who wears all the hats in an earlier stage company. This is a great list to go off of because most of the companies on this list have anywhere between 20 to 100 employees instead of thousands and thousands and thousands of employees. So it's also a great way to find new software that you can test out and try and see why these companies are breaking out, right? Read about them, look at the teardowns online where people talk about what certain features are their killer features and why people are using it in a sticky way that they are, and try the apps for yourselves. It gives you a product sense yourself of what products are loved by people and why they're loved. And the final thing I'll leave you with is one of the most important things that I learned this year. This year, my new company, Mighty Health, which I can talk about later, but it's really kind of not salient to this conversation. We had a chance to go to another accelerator. We actually attended Y Combinator, which is the world's #1 accelerator. It's where Dropbox, Airbnb, Instacart, you name it, has come from that, from this cruise automation, et cetera. They've all come from Y Combinator. And during Y Combinator, one of the big things that happens every Tuesday is they'll bring a former YC alumni to come back and share, impart wisdom upon all of us young founders, right? And so one of the dinners this year was actually with Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia, who are the co-founders of Airbnb. And so they sat down, they shared their kind of spiel about Airbnb. At this point, they've given that talk so many times, it's almost like a comedy show. It's like the two of them kind of like reflect off of each other and talk about the story of setting up Airbnb. Some of you may have heard the story on an amazing podcast called How I Built This with Guy Raz, where he talks about the story of Airbnb. I would encourage you to check out that episode if you actually want to listen to that podcast. But that's not actually the part that stuck with me from this talk. At the very, very end of the talk, in the kind of remaining 5 minutes, it was like 9 p.m. All of us were like ready to go home. Joe and Brian talked about how right now it's easier than ever to build a company. It's easier than ever to do engineering even, because we have so many tools and languages and frameworks and structures that are available to us today compared to 40 years ago or even 10 years ago. My friend and I, who were setting up a podcast, we were literally using 5 or 6 different no-code tools to set up the podcast. Neither of us code. And yet we can set up a landing page. We set up a type form to capture people's email addresses. We put all of our podcast episodes inside of Notion behind a password. So we literally, and we're using Anchor to record the podcast, which automatically disseminates the podcast to Spotify, Apple. This is the easiest podcast or thing to start, right? Like compare this to 10 years ago where people had to like go through it and code their podcast and manually upload it to each of these platforms and all those things. But you get the point. It's easier than ever to do anything that you want to do. So what I encourage you to do is consider which mountain you want to climb. It's easier than ever to climb any mountain, but which mountain will you climb, right? It's easier than ever to kind of go with the flow and do what everyone else is doing. But where do you really want to spend time in your life? The reason I'm doing Mighty Health is because my dad had a humongous health scare a few years ago. He got rushed to UCLA for an open heart surgery. He nearly died. And this was in the middle of me taking college finals. And that gave him a second lease on life, but it reminded me the importance of working on health and how health is the baseline for everyone's happiness and fulfillment. And without health, such as my IBS, there's not really much else that you can do because you're so worried about health. It's your baseline. And that's why we're working on Mighty Health, to help older people with their health. But when you're considering what internships you want to take in the next few years, what jobs you want to take and apply for, and also where you spend your time on a day-to-day basis, think about this. Which mountain will you climb? Because we can climb any mountain, but it's up to you to choose what's the very most important for you. So I'll break there. I'm going to drink some water, but thank you for your attention, and happy to kind of stick around and answer any questions as well, either about anything I've talked about or any of the other topics about working in tech. The last thing I will say is this is kind of like a weird, shameless self-promotion kind of thing, but I do have a blog that specifically listed all those templates. So I'm not trying to promote my blog or anything, but I'm just telling you that there's an article there that is at jameslee.com. and it has the templates. So in case you weren't able to screenshot those earlier, it just has all the templates that are there. You can kind of copy and paste them, or you can copy them for finding mentors. And then I have other startup advice there as well. But happy to kind of answer anything, any possible questions that you may have about entrepreneurship.
Great. Thank you, James. That was awesome. So if you guys have any questions, just like always, you can either turn on your mic if you feel comfortable with that, or you can send them in the chat, and we can answer them that way. But this is a rare opportunity, guys, because for the rest of the semester it's just going to be me again. So if you have any questions about how James got to where he is today, or just questions about just the business side or anything about entrepreneurship, now is really the time to ask.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for in terms of creating, do you have any tips for people for entrepreneurship that don't really know what they want to create? And like, how can we get that idea for
Yeah.
entrepreneurs?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, Justin, maybe you led a little bit of a workshop on this last week too, on terms of like identifying problems, right? I think ultimately it's the easiest answer to that is to try to scratch your own itch. So ideally you want to identify problems that you find in your own life and try to see if there's potentially products or services or software that you can create for those problems. And I know that is, we kind of live in this world. It's like, we always talk about this, the comparison between like third world problems versus like, what we're facing in our day-to-day lives. And so there really aren't any like problems per se, but obviously there are still lots of things that can be improved in our day-to-day lives. So that's number one, is I would kind of turn inward and look at your own life basically and figure out if there's something in your life that you would say that you want to improve in your kind of immediate world. So for me personally, I started Mighty Health because of my dad's own health experience, right? Like I noticed that he went to surgery, luckily like surgery went well, and then he came home and the doctor told him to exercise more and eat healthier. And he was like, I don't know what that means, because I've literally been doing the same thing for the last 50 years of my life. And what kinds of exercises are safe for me? What kinds of foods should I be eating and should not be eating? How do I get some more weight loss so I can like decrease my risk of heart disease again? Can I travel? Can I have caffeine? He had all these questions, and there was no one really to help him, because the way that our healthcare system is structured is it's very like solutions oriented, in terms of, you come into the hospital, you have surgery, you get fixed, right? But no one really supports you kind of in between those doctor's visits. That was basically what was the inspiration for starting Mighty Health, was like, okay, that seems like inefficient, right? Like it seems like ideally there could be someone that could support my dad throughout that process. And so we created an app that coaches him how to do it every day. Like he has like this coach that texts with him, and then there's videos that he can follow, and there's a nutrition plan with like a shopping list that's on his fridge. Like all of this stuff is now like created for him. So it's similar in your life as well. Like this is actually why a lot of developer tools get created, right? Like if you look at every YC batch, Y Combinator batch of companies, almost a third of the companies are actually developer tools, because they're kind of scratching their own itch. Like as engineers, are there things, or there pieces of software that could be more efficient, right? Are there ways, like I have a buddy of mine who has a lot of like carpal tunnel. So he has a lot of RSI, and he's tried every voice dictation software out there for coding, and he doesn't feel like any of them are really that great. So he's considering starting a brand new voice dictation software, like creating a brand new voice dictation software. So it really comes down to like, if there's something that's bothering your life, and kind of thinking about that, and being patient too. Sometimes a lot of people put a lot of pressure on themselves to be like, I need to think of an idea this month because I really want to start a company, but sometimes it just doesn't happen like that, right? A lot of it needs to come from also inspiration, just really paying attention to what's going on in your own life, what other companies are doing, what companies you think are cool, and then really making a note of those, chewing those over, and talking to a roommate or a friend or someone like that about them, and be like, hey, like, I feel like I just took a taxi, and the taxi's kind of like really dirty, and like it was hard to like get the taxi. Like, would it be weird if I could call a taxi on my phone? Right. And that's literally the conversation that like one of my mentors had with Garrett Camp when they were launching Uber. Like and at the time, like a lot of his friends were like, no, that's dumb, man. Like I would never do that with my phone. And like, look at Uber today. So that's a lot of the conversations that you have early on, is like, don't try to keep it in your head. Talk to people about it, talk it out, get some feedback, ideally be around, again, the 5 people you spend the most time with, be around people who will kind of edify you and build you up. And so they'll be like, yeah, man, like actually, what if you did it this way, right? Like kind of brainstorming with you, and then allow your idea to evolve that way. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you so much.
Cool. Yeah, of course.
I have a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm gonna give like a hypothetical situation. So say I go through that process and I find a problem in my life, and I think of a solution, and I go through and do my research, and I see that there's no other companies or anyone else that has really thought of an idea on how to solve it. And say down the line, I'm like almost ready to launch this solution, and then another company beats me like right before I release. How much of a problem is that?
Yeah, zero actually. So what you're referring to in the industry is kind of called like a first mover advantage. So a lot of people are like, oh, well, if you're not first, then then it's not worth doing. But if you look in the space time and time again, that's not necessarily true, right? Like for every Uber, there's also a Lyft, but also for every Yahoo, there's a Google, right? And like there's always better ways to do it. And I think the kind of key thing to remember is like ideas are like worth a cent, right? Execution is 99 cents, right? It's like, it's so much, execution is everything. So and these days it's extremely unlikely that you'll find an idea that nobody's working on, right? There's millions of people interested in entrepreneurship and lots of people who are hopefully suffering the same problem that you are. And so ideally, we actually think it's actually scarier if you don't see competition, because that just means that you're the only person encountering that problem, and like you're kind of in your own bubble or your own world. If you see some other companies or other people trying to solve this problem as well, or at least talking about it online, then it's actually a great problem to have. It means that the problem that you're pursuing is much more validated, right? So that's really, really important. But going back to execution, ultimately, it comes down to execution, right? You could have the same exact idea. You could even have the same business plan in like day one, but how you execute, like how hard you work at it, every little small detail, like does your website look better than theirs? Does your product incite more love for your product than theirs? Do your customers talk about your product more often and spread more word of mouth than theirs? Everything matters. And so I wouldn't be too concerned at all about that specific problem.
Okay, so would you say it boils down to what you can offer compared to your competitors?
It depends on the cycle of where your competitors are. If they're just starting as well, then honestly, it's just a foot race. Like it doesn't really matter, right? Like, when we were starting out with, like, for example, right now with Mighty Health, if we ask most people what other apps they've used in the past, they don't say most of the competitors that we know of, right? Like we just found a new competitor yesterday that was called ageboldly or something.com. And like, we've never heard of them on any of our like calls, right? Because they're just as young as we are. And so essentially, like, just focus on your own lane, right? Just focus on doing as good of a job as you can and getting the word out there. And maybe you guys are starting in two different geographic areas or, et cetera, but it doesn't really matter because the market is so big that you can have multiple players in the beginning. That said, I would say that you want to look for a differentiator from the incumbent, right? So if there is a large company that's out there that everyone knows of, like say you were solving a specific problem and there's immediately like a brand that comes to mind where you're like, I really want to, help people get around the city faster by like having like ride share. And I'd be like, okay, but doesn't Uber and Lyft do that? That's when you do need like a differentiator. You're like, yes, but the change on that is that I'm using scooters instead of XYZ, or maybe my scooters are all, motorized instead of, manual, or the way you rent out the scooters is not from a station and an app, but this way, right? Or we actually deliver the scooter to you. And I'm like, okay, I get it now, right? So if there's a big incumbent that everyone already knows about, then yes, it is absolutely important for you to differentiate yourself. And that's, called positioning. It's like you're either faster, you're better, you're cheaper, etc. That really is important. But if you're in a newish market, which kind of according to your story at the beginning, it sounds like there's some other companies that are just starting or maybe just started before you, etc., then I wouldn't worry too much about it. Just focus on executing, focus on finding customers to pay for whatever you're creating, and go from there.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. We have a question in the chat box that is, do you get an LLC before you start your company? So my short answer to that is no. A lot of people think the first thing you do when you start a company is you got to get an LLC, you got to get a domain name, and then you got to print business cards, etc. Those are all important. Getting a logo, getting a brand name, those are all important. But the most important thing by far is figuring out if the problem you're solving is actually how it's being solved right now, how you plan on solving it, and validating all of that. So talking to customers, getting out there, putting out surveys, scheduling interviews with people who could potentially become customers of yours. So for example, if I had an idea today to start a brand new fitness company and I want to create an app that allows people to track their workouts at their home gyms, the first thing I would do is not to start an LLC or anything like that. I would actually try to schedule time with 5 or 10 of my friends who I know work out at home and try to do 30-minute conversations with them. And I have a blog post about like what questions you can ask and things like that too. But you basically, poke around on the problem. The time to start an LLC, I would say, is as late as possible. And it's usually when you need to start a bank account. You cannot start a business bank account until you have some kind of corporate entity. And so that's usually the latest point of when I will create the LLC, because it actually costs a lot of money to create an LLC. In California, it costs at least $800 to do it. So it's kind of annoying. And there's an annual fee. So on the next deadline for the next year, you're gonna have to pay for the LLC fee again. And then the last thing I'll say on that is if you're starting a small business that you're just meaning to run on your own and it's going to be profitable, etc., then I would just do a LLC. It's the fastest way to get started. It's the cheapest. And it has tax benefits as well that you can research. If you're planning on raising money from investors in the future, then I highly recommend you get a Delaware C Corp. And instead of starting with an LLC and having to convert it into a C Corp later and having to pay a lot of money to convert it, I would use something like Stripe Atlas. That's ATLAS, Stripe Atlas. It's like this super, super easy tool that Stripe, that company that does all the payments, created for small businesses and startups like us to be able to quickly set up and incorporate a company, and a Delaware LLC is their preferred method. There's a lot of things I could go into about why Delaware, et cetera, but it's essentially every venture-backed company is a Delaware C Corp. So stick to that if you're going to raise money. If you're not, then start an LLC, ideally in the state that you're based, so California in this case. Because if you don't and you're doing business in California anyway, you're going to have to pay California LLC taxes. So you're double paying, and that doesn't really make sense, at least in the beginning. Hopefully that helps. Do you have any contingency for when major decisions, life, business, did not work out? Oh, that's a great question. So a lot of people think about like startups as being super, super risky, right? And I think there is absolutely that, like, there's a lot of bit of truth to that, right? Like when you listen to the Airbnb's guys' stories, like they talk about how they maxed out every single credit card. They literally had like one of those like old sports trading card folders. Like I had one for Pokemon when I was a kid, and they have like literally they applied for so many credit cards and maxed out every credit card that they could fill up a binder like that. And that's not what I normally suggest to people, right? Like, I mean, you have to have a certain level of commitment to your company to do that. But a lot of people talk about like startups being like super, super risky. Like, oh my gosh, how could you take this risk? But the way I see it is it's actually not that risky compared to a lot of other things. Like when you work for someone else, you're always at risk of potentially getting laid off if the company's not doing well, et cetera, right? So the risk, relatively speaking, is just only a little bit higher. And the reason I say that is because in most cases, when I've done stuff for the companies I've done, I've usually raised the money before I've gone full time. So for example, my last company, Encore Alert, we got acquired by a company here in San Francisco called Meltwater. So they bought our company, our product became part of their company. We went and worked there for 2 years. When I was considering starting Mighty Health, I did a ton of research while still staying at Meltwater. And I only left at the very like specific moment when I knew that I needed to go and raise money from investors. And then I went and raised $500,000 and started paying myself from that. So if you think about it that way, like I actually haven't put a lot of my own personal finances at risk because I've been able to kind of leverage a lot of that process I talked about earlier to get investors on board and get them to, take on a lot of the risk early on as well. So what I mean by that is that school often is actually the very, very best time to start a company, because the worst thing that you could possibly do is that you could just end up being a student again, right? Like you kind of have, of course, like a lot of people have different financial situations and things like that, and you're working other jobs, but ultimately like you have the safety net of still having school, right? Like this is still your job right now, like to be a student. And so it's also a fantastic time to start a company or to try something different, because there's an additional safety net there that, like, for example, when you're in the adult world and you're paying for rent and you're the only source of income, et cetera, you're going to be much less likely to actually take those risks. So the short answer is, yes, I actually had a lot of contingency plans because you could do a lot of things on the side before committing full time. And being able to create that optionality for yourself before committing is, I think, part of the game that you play. Well, maybe time for one last question.
I have a quick question, James. So so actually, we haven't talked about this much too, but like Felipe's background is computer science, right? So how was like that first initial interaction between like you and Felipe? And like, I know you talked about it a little in your presentation, but like, I think, a lot of, everyone here is basically an engineer. So if they do decide they want to go form a company, probably they want to interact with maybe like a business student in a business school. So, do you have any advice on, how to get that interact? Because sometimes it feels like, we speak like a different language than like business people.
Yeah. I think that's true. I think that, I think what's most important for us when we talk to each other is a mutual sense of respect, right? Like he respects that I know my domain areas, and then I respect that I know that he knows his. And so when we talk about something product related or code related, of course, I defer to him all the time. But what I've gotten really good at, and like ideally you can kind of bridge this gap, is like trying your best to understand a little bit of the other person's language, right? I actually truly believe what you just said, Justin, which is like, it really feels like two different languages. And sometimes I forget that because when we have a new marketing intern or someone join our team and they join one of our product meetings, afterwards I'm like, how'd that go? And they're like, that was gibberish to me. Like I didn't understand a single thing. Like you guys are running like a agile sprint inside of like a Kanban board that using these user stories that measures this hypothesis. I'm like, like I realize that a lot of that is not even actual technical. It's just more of like product management and things like that. So a lot of it is just kind of like blending that together. And I actually think that the language, the shared mutual language that is blended together is the language of product. So there's engineering and there's business, but where they meet is actually product. And I know a lot of you probably have heard about kind of the concept of like product management. Some PMs are more technical and know how to code. Some of them, and I've PM'd a lot myself, are not technical. But it's a sense of like where like the needs of the business meet the execution of the engineering. And where you talk about that is actually in product. And product means a lot of things. I mean, this is a whole different lecture on its own. But what it fundamentally means is like how you plan the vision for where you want the product to go and the process of which you execute it, right? So like, for example, at Mighty Health, we run weekly sprints. So every Monday, the business team and the product team and engineering all come together on Mondays from like 10 a.m. to noon. And when we sit down and we talk about what are we all going to accomplish this week and what are the parts of the product that we're going to ship, right? And so I will come from the perspective like, hey, I've been hearing a lot from our customers that they really want a Fitbit integration with our app. And then the engineering team or the product team needs to really understand what I mean by that and translate that. Okay, well, actually, there's this one API online that allows us to integrate with Fitbit, Garmin, and Samsung all at the same time. How does that sound? I'm like, that's fantastic. And sometimes, like, now that I've been working with them for so long, I will find that API myself and like, I'll be like, hey, I suggest you guys use this aggregator to do it. But it's like, it's just from years of working together, right? But it's just really trying to bridge that gap there in the middle where it's like, okay, how do you meet those kind of needs together? Okay, last thing about mentors. How do I find the right mentor? I'm not sure what you mean by that. Yeah, that's a great question. So kind of to make them a little bit more a little bit more concrete. I don't mean like you got to go get like LeBron James to be your mentor, right? Like a lot of people talk about like, I'm gonna go get this best-selling author, et cetera, et cetera. But what I mean by mentor is just someone in your life or someone you've read about that has done what you want to do. That's it. So like, for example, for me, what a mentor is any entrepreneur who maybe has taken a company to a Series B or Series C, like a little bit further than I have, or maybe has gone through a bigger acquisition. That's mainly it. And I will have coffee with them and sit down and be like, hey, right now I'm dealing with this really sticky situation where one of our team members isn't performing as high as they should, as well as they should. What should I do about that team member, right? So when you mention like Gary Vee, for example, finding a mentor, et cetera, maybe someone in your life. So I'll just give you like a super concrete example. If any of you guys want to become an engineering professor one day, Justin can become your mentor. That's it. I'm not talking about anything crazy. I'm not talking about like someone like on the news or on TV that you have to meet. anybody in your life or an extension of that could be helpful. And that's where I told you LinkedIn kind of comes into play. This is why we add people on LinkedIn, is because if you add Justin on, Justin Trent is the GOAT. I agree with you. But if you add someone on LinkedIn, like if I add Justin on LinkedIn, I can actually see his network. So I can see who he's connected with and say that I'm not interested in engineering, but I'm interested in a specific part of business. So I'm like, I need an accounting mentor, right? So like, Justin, do you know anyone from the business school that like teaches accounting that I can meet with for 30 minutes? That's literally it, right? I love, you're gonna see the love coming in through the chat box. That's really what I mean, is just someone who can answer the questions that you have at this moment. Right? It's like the questions that we had earlier, like, do you need to start an LLC before you start a company? Like, find someone else who has an LLC that you know and talk to them. It's like, hey, when you first started your company, like, what was the process like of doing an LLC? Did you choose California or Delaware or Nevada, and why? Right? I did some research on my own. It seems like people are kind of split on that. Why did you choose California? That's really what I mean by mentors, is someone who's a step ahead of you, who can answer questions for you and save you a lot of effort from the mistakes that they've made in the past.
I'll add on to that a little bit too, because I've talked to a lot of mentors too, and I think when people think of mentors, they think of someone that's like older than, like really successful. But it could even just be like, your friend, like you're like someone in this class that they may have gotten an internship last year, and you want to say like, hey, what was the process that you went to do that? And so it's just really anyone that's experienced something that you also want to experience, and you can talk to them and ask them questions about how did they get there, and that's always going to be something that's valuable.
Yeah, the question was, how many mentors have you had? I mean, really, it's just, I mean, if you actually want to count on it, it's probably hundreds, right? Because it's like, we talk to different people about different problems. Like even at Mighty Health, we have 6 different doctors that are mentoring us and advising us. We have 3 sales mentors. It's just lots of people that we're constantly getting advice from. And it's up to you to filter that advice, right? To figure out what's good advice and what's bad. But some mentors you meet with once and that's it. You never talk to them ever again. You send them a nice follow-up email. You thank them for the time and you kind of move on. And some people, you really, really enjoy the conversation. Everything clicks, like you have great chemistry. And then that's the type of person that you might want to keep in touch with for like years to come, right? So a lot of times to find that person, you'll have to talk to 10 others just to find that one person you click with. And so just go out there and talk to people, right? Like try to schedule time and coffee with people, get to learn, be curious, prepare those questions, and talk to people every month or so. Like kind of set yourself a goal, and then maybe you'll find someone that you really click with.
Great. Any last minute, super quick questions in the last that can be answered in 15 seconds? All right, so I think we're out of time. So thank you, James. That was, really, really awesome. So I really thank you for, sharing your experience and, answering all these questions. I think it's definitely something that's going to be really valuable. So, what I do is I usually upload these onto YouTube. So I'll send you the YouTube link if you want to use this for anything too. So,
perfect.
So, you see everyone in the chats thanking you too. So, I want to say thank you everyone also for tuning in today. So on Thursday, we'll go back to our regularly scheduled programming on present worth analysis. Maybe that's something, James, you learned in like freshman year at Georgetown, but this is our basic economics class. But yeah, thank you everyone again, especially thank you, James, for your time. I'll stick around the call if you guys have, because I know I just graded homework 1 and homework 2 is just posted, but James, I know you got stuff to do. So thank you again, and I'll see you around.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.